Later the floor for comments, but first of all we have two respondents. The first one is Professor Alon Confino, who from the University of Virginia, but also from Ben-Gurion University. Professor Confino deals a lot with modern Germany and Europe and the Holocaust and commemoration and Israel studies, Jewish and Israel studies as well. I'll just mention two of his publications, although there are of course a lot more. Some of them deals with Germany and Germany history and modern German history and question of memory, but two of them which are very much connected to the issues that Raz mentioned here are the fundamental past, the Holocaust as a historical understanding, which was published in 2012, and A World Without Jews, the Nazi Imagination from Persecution to Genocide, which was published in 2014. So Alon, please.
So good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored by the invitation. I would have liked actually to stand with a nice podium here, but apparently it's impossible. So maybe I'll stand, then I'll sit, then I'll stand again. We'll see. So I'd like to give my readings of Raz's stimulating book. I say my reading because every good book, or every book that is good, as this book, takes the reader into territories that perhaps the author did not think about. It triggers our imagination. It makes us think in new ways. It gives us insights that maybe the author, whether it is a literary author, or a historian or a scholar, did not think about just because we all have our own imaginary faculties. So I'd like to give my own reading of the book. By this I'm taking Raz off the hook. But that's what I thought. Raz proposes a rereading of the Holocaust by placing it within a broader context of ethnic cleansing, of genocides, of nation building, of European history. By focusing on Greater Hungary and Greater Bulgaria, Raz conceives of the Holocaust as part of colonial expansions and mass violence that happened in two countries as they attempted to build ethno-national states. So he uses the idea of colonial expansion not for the colonies in Africa, in Australia, in America, in the Americas, in Asia, but as a European project of various ethno-national states. By doing this, it challenges us to think anew of the relations between modern European history, between modern state and society, and the Holocaust. And he's challenging us to think of building blocks of interpretation in Holocaust studies, terms such as Holocaust, victims, perpetrators, bystanders, as he places the mass violence against the Jews within the context of the regions which he told us. Methodologically, I can see that he combines two approaches. One is building on comparative genocide and colonial studies. We said he looks at the ethno-national aspirations of Bulgaria and Hungary within the context of colonial expansion. Colonial expansion means that there are those who are others. Usually these others are conceived of as also not as developed human groups that needs to be somehow removed. Not necessarily all killed, but they need to be removed from the body politics. And he's also building on the approach that sees East European ethnic conflicts as closely related to the extermination of the Jews, arguing that the Holocaust should be understood, among others, as wartime interactions, I'm quoting, of communal violence. This may seem obvious. Well, obviously the Holocaust happened within the violence of the war. So what's so new about it? Well, I think there is an element of radicality. There is a radical element in what Raz is saying. He's basically saying there was no Holocaust. There were Holocausts. Actually, there weren't even Holocausts. There were various extermination of Jews that, while being connected, because the Nazis had an idea that all Jews should be exterminated, they were in their circumstances, they were specific, and in this specificity determined how Jews would be exterminated, why, and by whom. It is this that leads Raz to an idea that I'm not so sure that I agree with, but I find it really intriguing, that the idea of calling the Holocaust with a capital H should be rethought. Was there really a Holocaust? Was there really one process that determined this event? We can't even call it an event. It's a series of events over several years that crossed over not only from Paris to Vilna, but also to Benghazi. What is the common denominator? And is this common denominator really insightful to understand various aspects of the Holocaust? He thus combines Holocaust history and modern European history to give us a new understanding of the Holocaust. Here, I think, lies the originality of the book. He challenges the idea that the extermination of the Jews can be understood in the main as an event unto itself, or as an event that is fully explainable via anti-Semitic sentiments. Now here I should qualify and explain what I mean, since I published 2 years ago a book which is called A World Without Jews. So is anti-Semitism important or not important? Well, both, of course. A world without Jews means that the Nazis had to have an imagination that this specific human group must be exterminated in order for Nazi civilization to be built, for various reasons. But in itself, this cannot be the only explanation for what happened in the Holocaust, because, as Raz tries to show, there were the specificity of certain circumstantial conditions. To my mind, we should combine the two things. There was a Nazi imagination of a world without Jews. The Jews that posed an existential threat in the mind of the Nazis to German identity, to German history, to the German Reich, to the German new civilization. This idea made it possible to imagine, legitimize the extermination of the Jews. But within this broad arc, there were specificities that we have to take into account. That's how I would put the two things together. So, I'd like to place Raz's book and contribution within larger trends in Holocaust historiography, using some of my current work on the Holocaust. And I'd like to think about these current books, about these current trends, and about the book with the term Provincializing the Holocaust. I take my cue from Dipesh Chakrabarty's thought-provoking book, Provincializing Europe, about post-colonial thought and Indian history. I find the term good to think with about the Holocaust and the changes in its meaning since 1945 in general, and in the last generation in particular, since this relates more closely to Raz's book. I don't mean to impose post-colonialism on the Holocaust. Instead, thinking in association, I use provincializing the Holocaust as a metaphor, as an intellectual trigger to think critically and distinguish between historical understanding of the Holocaust and claims made by the memory of the Holocaust. Provincializing the Holocaust means an attempt to keep the past at the past and to liberate it from the demands of present memory, identity, and the demands of national identity. Provincializing the Holocaust is not a project of minimizing the Holocaust, not at all. On the contrary, it is based on the recognition of the status of the Holocaust as a foundational past and its interpretation as an event with universal meaning. Provincializing the Holocaust is precisely to find out how venerated topics of a generation ago, for example, that the Holocaust is unique, is inconceivable, was unimaginable, that these ideas are not inherent in the event, but rather that they reflect specific perceptions bounded in space and time of contemporaries a generation or two ago. It takes such venerable concepts and transforms them from blocking our understanding into fruitful interpretative research tools. It is in this sense that I recognize a deep depth to the tradition of thinking about the Holocaust. Only I attempt to show how some of its ideas can be viewed historically in their particular setting. And I think that Raz's book is part of this tradition, part of this new approach in Holocaust studies. And I'd like to give you a few examples. So, with this term in mind, we can understand some of the changes in Holocaust interpretation in the last generation. The term both explicates and emerges from current trends in Holocaust historiography. For example, around 1990, so a generation ago, a key theoretical debate in Holocaust studies was about the possibilities of narrating the Holocaust, whether the Holocaust allowed for any kind of narrative, and about the possibility of producing at all a historical representation of the Holocaust. Today, things are seen very differently. As Dan Stone has observed, it is not that with Auschwitz one encounters special problems of representation, but rather that Auschwitz makes especially clear the problem of representation, the fact that there is always exists a lacuna between the representation and what is represented. For the historian, the Holocaust does not present exceptional problems of representation, but conversely, it plainly reveals problems of historical representations overall. Differently put, far from being unique, the Holocaust only lays bare more clearly what is an essential element in all historical understanding. One important subject that has changed in the last generation is the notion of the space of the Holocaust. One dominant view in the 1980s and 90s was that the Holocaust belongs to German history or Jewish history or both. This view was reflected in the seminal debate in the late 1980s between Saul Friedlander and Martin Borchardt on the meaning and interpretation of the Holocaust. Borchardt was a German historian, and Friedlander, of course, is a Jewish, Israeli, American historian. Recent historiography has recast the space of the Holocaust, not without debate. Of course, all these changes occurred within debates among historians. Now, the space of the Holocaust is seen very differently. The extermination of the Jews is also part of a vast universe of Nazi, other genocides and victims, of the European drive to create homogeneous nation states, and of global colonial genocides, or, as Tim Snyder recently argued in his book Bloodlands, of the cumulative commingling genocides between Hitler and Stalin in Eastern Europe. Regardless whether we we agree to all these interpretations, we accept them or not, the space of the Holocaust does not belong anymore only to German and Jews. We can see it in a way in the new work of comparative Holocaust studies, which has influenced Raz's book a great deal. Scholars such as Donna Bloxham and Dirk Moses have argued that the Nazi ideas of race and inferior groups who had no right to live belong in the tradition of European colonialism, which long before 1933 and the Nazis provided popular, scientific, and political legitimacy to colonial genocides around the world. Similarly, the enmity against and extermination of the Jews was part of a Nazi universe of racial enemies and exterminations. The Jewish genocide was bound up with a set of racial ideas that produced other Nazi mass killings and genocides. In that respect, the Holocaust can be understood only when placed within the comparative history of modern genocides. This view placed the Holocaust within a larger geopolitical context in which it took place: Hungary, Bulgaria, the European continent, as well as within the genre of historical event in which it took place, that is, genocides. Now again, I should say, I put this in conjunction with the importance of the idea of anti-Semitism and of the Jews and of the way the Nazis recast Jewish history, modern anti-Semitism, and German history in order to place the Jews as the eternal enemy that must be exterminated in order for German civilization to arise out of the Third Reich. So it's not either or. It's both comparative genocide and the role of the Jew in the Nazi imagination. So more specifically to Raz's book, transnational research has focused on Eastern Europe as the site of the Holocaust and several other instances of ethnic cleansing and genocides between the 1920s and 1945. According to this approach, the Holocaust was an integral part, as we heard, of the colonial aspirations that stood at the heart of nation building, such as in Bulgaria and Hungary. The drive to build ethnic homogeneous states led to ethnic cleansing and genocides against Jews and other minority groups. So, what do we have when we combine this very, of course, sketchy idea of provincializing the Holocaust and of the changes in Holocaust historiography in the last generation, and when we think of Raz's book? So I view the book as part of this trend within Holocaust historiography. The great challenge and promise of this approach is to write a combined history that takes into equal consideration the Holocaust and Nazi genocides from the perspective of Jewish victims and other groups of victims, without creating a moral, theoretical, and methodological hierarchy among them. And I think Raz's book is an important step in this direction. Finally, to provincialize the Holocaust means to attempt to overcome cultural taboos and restrictions on what can and cannot be said, and what we about what we can and cannot imagine, about what we don't allow ourselves to ask. With respect to the Holocaust and to connecting it to other events. Such cultural restrictions, at times imperceptible, are particularly present in societies where the memory of the Holocaust is an essential building block of national identity. Israel is such a case. I would like to propose that one thing that I took from this book, we ought to think of the historical connections. Connections is the key word here. historical connections of the drive to create homogeneous nation states in Hungary and Bulgaria during World War II, in other places in the world in the 1940s, such as India and Pakistan, or after 1945, Czechoslovakia, Poland, again Hungary, and including Palestine and Israel in 1948. That is, we ought to think of the historical connections between the extermination of the Jews in Hungary and Bulgaria, as described to us by Raz, and the Nakba. The idea here, or the main point here, is about historical connections in the way that Raz described it very well. This is not historical analogy, this is not historical comparison, certainly not likeness, historical connections between various events in the 1940s where the creation of homogeneous nation state has several historical commonalities, one of which, a key one of which, is the identification of one group as alien to another group and the efforts to remove it, this way or another. Of course, the Holocaust and the Nakba are completely different in their magnitude and historical character. It is obvious. One is a genocide geared toward total extermination, while the other is an ethnic cleansing geared toward removing, not annihilating, an ethnic group. But here I think that Raz's idea, and this thought came to me only this morning in the cab when I arrived here, which means that sometimes it's good to take a cab, especially since you paid for it. So it's not about the cab, but sometimes when we think about what we want to say, then suddenly in the most unexpected places we have an idea. So now that I think about it, it's not to connect the Holocaust with a capital H to the Nakba. This I don't think will work, because the Holocaust is a very different idea. But it is to connect parts of the Holocaust, the parts that Raz talked about, that are parts of. The Holocaust is not what Raz talked about. The Holocaust is the extermination of European Jews in its totality, from Paris to Rome to Benghazi to Vilna. It's a European-wide extermination. But in the way that Raz has described it, in Bulgaria and Hungary, it's a very specific historical case. The drive to build a homogeneous nation states that identify ethnic enemies and did what it could to remove them. This, I think, goes hand in hand with what happened in India and Pakistan in 1947, in Palestine and Israel in 1948, and in post-1945, 1946, 1947, in Czechoslovakia and Poland and Hungary in the expulsion of 11 million Germans. So the two events, the Holocaust and the Nakba, are completely different. This should be placed immediately on the table, because obviously for Israeli Jews this is the raw reaction. This is clear, it's not about this. But the making of a homogeneous nation states across Europe and in the sub-Indian continent and in Israel and Palestine was characterized by removing an ethnic group deemed alien. Our historical understanding of these events is based on the potential of radical violence found in ethnic nationalism and in the modern nation state. This is a worldwide thing. It's not related only to Europe or only to this or that continent. So what happened in Hungary, in Bulgaria, in other places, is characterized by purifying national violence, to which societies construct and craft national memories in order to explain it. There are a lot of explanations, always to the group of the perpetrators and why it was important, why it was a security important, why it was many different kinds of importances. But as scholars, we have to look at these narratives as narratives of justification. Perhaps some of the justifications are also historically true. It is fine. But we cannot accept the subjective experience of people in the past as the historical truth. This type of nationalism constantly engages in defining the ethnic identity of the nation state and its efforts at ethnic homogenization. It defines the ethnic identity of the state and also the ethnic enemies of the state. It happens everywhere. And 1948, in our places, is part of this history. Again, let me say, because I know that one needs to say it, the Holocaust and the Nakba are completely different events. There are other reasons to the Holocaust, as I made it clear. But what happened in Bulgaria, in Hungary, and other places in the 1940s around the globe share a certain sense. These are events that in certain sense share the same type of political logic. So, let me end. So we ought to explore these historical connections, not in spite, but because this is obviously a past in our society that has not passed, 1948, I mean, a raw historical nerve. Of course, among Israeli Jews, as we know, the emotional resistance to these historical connections is tremendous. We should find a way to overcome them. And in this sense, by provincializing the Holocaust, we may in fact broadening our historical horizons, imagination, and humanity. Thank you.